Capsule Museum Coach House for a noon program today, sponsored by the Washington 125 Commemoration Committee. This is another in a series of programs that we are hosting this fall leading up to the commemoration on November 11th at the Legislative Building, and I hope you all will be attending that. My name is Susan Rohr. I'm with the Washington State Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Knute Berger to the State Capitol Museum and to Olympia. Mr. Berger is well known for his clever, humorous, and insightful views on Seattle culture, history, and its people, from his position as Mossback, a featured columnist on the online paper that he operates called Crosscut. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's really an interesting and provocative piece of journalism. In addition to writing for Crosscut, Mr. Berger is editor-in-large and columnist for Seattle Magazine and a regular guest on Weekday on the NPR affiliate KUOW. And for those of us in the South Sound, you can hear that at 1340 a.m. on the dial here. In 2001, Knute was named writer-in-residence at the Space Needle and is author of Space Needle, The Spirit of Seattle, the official 50th anniversary history of the tower, and of course part of the Century 21 50th commemorations in 2012. He also won the Washington State Historic Preservation Officer's Annual Media Award for his coverage of heritage issues for Crosscut in 2008. He is the author of Pugitopolis, a Mossback takes on growth addicts, weather wimps, and the myth of Seattle nice. A Seattle native, Berger has long been a writer and editor for local magazines and newspapers, was editor-in-chief of Seattle Weekly, founding editor and publisher of East Side Week, and editor of Washington and Adventure Travel magazines. He has worked for the Hope Hart Institute and, of course, the Washington State Centennial Commission, where he developed the concept of the Time Capsule, which he will be speaking about today, which is coming back to everyone's attention as part of the 125th anniversary of statehood. Thank you very much for making the journey down to Olympia today. We welcome you, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. The journey was hardly a journey. It was an easy drive. But I'm thrilled to be here, and while I'm have been a writer and editor in Seattle, I also went to Evergreen, so I lived down here back in the early 70s. Today I'm here to talk about, my topic is how do you talk to the future, the story behind the world's first updatable time capsule. And I've amended to that along with a brief history of time capsules, because understanding the history of time capsules, what they are and where they came from, is kind of key to understanding what's interesting and unique about the one here in Olympia. I was the architect of that project for the Washington Centennial Commission in 1989, and that came about as a result of I became interested in time capsules as a writer. One of my very first professional freelance writing assignments while I was still at Evergreen was to research a list, come up with a fairly list of interesting time capsules that had been done throughout history for a book called The People's Almanac. And so I went into libraries and was digging through newspaper files and clips and microfilm and that kind of thing, came up with a list. And it turned out it was sort of the first time anybody had done such a list, and began getting referenced in academic papers and other things. And I just got hooked on the whole subject of time capsules. The Washington Centennial Time Capsule, you may have seen a giant green vault with the Northwest Tribal design on the front, behind glass in the south portico of the Legislative Building. It was placed there in 1989 and sealed in 1990. and it has some unique properties which I'll describe. But perhaps the first thing to know is that the capsule is one in a long line of human endeavors designed to assist one generation from communicating with another over long spans of time, imparting both knowledge and a physical legacy of some kind. Time capsules have been compared to many things: manufactured archaeological sites, tombs, buried treasure, messages in a bottle, even the Noah's Ark of civilization. So I'm going to give you an overview of the origins of time capsules, and we'll look at where did the idea of burying something for the future generations originate. Some ancient civilizations left objects with the intention of communicating with the future. Thousands of years ago, for example, the ancient Babylonians left clay cuneiform tablets, cones, and cylinders in the foundations of buildings, temples, and walls to inform future finders who had built the structures and why. They were obviously aware that the works of man, even the grandest works, were ephemeral and wanted future generations to know who to credit for literally laying the foundations of the future. These deposits, dating 4,000 or more years ago, are the earliest examples of specific messages buried that address the future finders. This clay cone was intended to let its future finders know that the walls of Sippar, where it was deposited, were constructed by Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. These buried cones were constructed with the hope that they would outlive the structures they recorded and transmit specific messages to later generations. And interestingly, the medium used, clay tablets, has proven to be one of the most durable forms of written communication, better than wax, parchment, paper, film, Twitter. In 1989, I asked the head of the Library of Congress Archives what was the best medium for long-term communication, and his immediate answer was terracotta. The reason being that if a library of clay tablets is destroyed by violence or fire, tablets can be pieced back together, and the clay can be fired and made more durable by the flames. Try to name another medium that gets stronger when you try to destroy it. The practice of foundation deposits continues to this day. By that I mean putting messages in the foundations of buildings. Many building cornerstones, especially public buildings, have deposits in them waiting for the day when they're knocked down or renovated. The Freemasons, a fraternal organization specialized in conducting cornerstone laying ceremonies, which usually included putting something into the foundation cornerstone. George Washington, for example, wore full Masonic regalia at the dedication of the cornerstone of the original U.S. Capitol building, and that cornerstone is missing, by the way. So we don't know if George Washington put anything into the cornerstone, but it would be unsurprising if he did. The Freemasons presided at official U.S. government cornerstone laying ceremonies until the practice was ended by President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. And this is interesting because often what is put into the building cornerstone now is called a time capsule. Next. This is the idea of communicating ancient knowledge to the future was popularized by the Rosicrucians in the 17th century. The group's legendary founder, Christian Rosenkreuz, was said to have been buried in a 7-sided tomb that was to be open in exactly 120 years. And this is one of the earliest examples of what is a defining characteristic of a time capsule, which is the instruction that the repository of information and artifacts be opened at a specified time, unlike a tomb or a cornerstone or a foundation deposit. The tomb was, the Rosicrucians said, a compendium of the universe and contained an artificial miniature sun. It was described thusly: every side of wall had a door for a chest wherein lay diverse things, especially our books. In another chest were looking glasses of diverse virtues, as also in other places were little bells, burning lamps, and chiefly wonderful artificial songs. Generally, all done to the end that it should happen after many hundreds of years, that the order of fraternity should come to nothing, that this vault might be restored again. So here you have the idea of people putting away information to be opened at a specific time with the expectation that it would contain technologies that were perhaps more advanced than the future would have, but would also allow the restoration of a particular culture if opened. Whether the tomb actually existed or not, we have the notion of preserving valuable knowledge for the future, locked and hidden in a place to be opened at a specific time, and that the future is an uncertain thing. Mythical or not, the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz describes exactly a modern time capsule. Let's jump ahead quickly to the 19th century. One of the first time capsules, though the term had not yet been coined, was displayed along with a Gatling gun, a telephone, and the monorail at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. It was called the Centennial Safe, and it was filled with information about the fair, photographs of prominent politicians, temperance literature, a silver inkstand, and a guest book of those who viewed it. And this is taken from the official guide to the Centennial. It's a description of the attractions. The materials were locked up in the safe after the fair, and it was transported to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. for safekeeping. It was to be opened in time for the U.S. Bicentennial in 1976. However, no one seemed to know what to do with it, and it was shunted around the Capitol and soon forgotten. Occasionally, someone would stumble across the safe in a basement or under a stairway, and stories would appear in the Capitol about the Capitol's mystery safe. Its purpose was forgotten, and it likely survived only because of congressional inertia. In 1976, someone showed up with a key to the safe. She was a descendant of the maid of the safe's originator. And the key had been passed down through her family with the instruction that in 1976 she go deliver it to the people at the U.S. Capitol for opening. It became part of the official bicentennial celebration, with President Gerald Ford doing the honors of opening the safe. This was an example of a time capsule that was lost, recovered by a group of people who were instructed to remember it. Next slide. In the 20th century, interest in saving information and artifacts took a new turn. In the late 1930s, the president of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia, Thornwell Jacobs, conceived what he called the Crypt of Civilization, which would be a repository of human knowledge in our times, slated to be open in the year 8113. Which he calculated would put it at the midpoint of recorded history at that time. In an underground vault, they included all kinds of modern technology, manual typewriters, a Burroughs adding machine, along with microfilm books, mannequins dressed in contemporary fashions, and scientific specimens. It also contained a hand crank machine designed to teach finders the English language. Jacobs was inspired by Howard Carter's discovery of King Tut's intact tomb in 1922. This photograph of Tut's antechamber shows a collection of everyday objects as furniture, such as the wheels of a chariot, that have given us an unprecedented look at royal ancient life. Thornwell Jacobs was worried, with the potential outbreak of war looming, that civilization might need to be rebooted at some future date. It was an experiment in what he called cosmic history. It was sealed in 1940, and metal tickets to the opening ceremony were issued for the year 8113. Oh, great. The crypt inspired a promoter of the Westinghouse Pavilion for the 1939-40 New York World's Fair, who got the idea to essentially miniaturize the crypt. And Westinghouse built a metal torpedo-shaped object out of a copper alloy and put everyday objects and microfilm into it to be opened in 69, roughly 5,000 years. A printed book describing the contents and recording its location was distributed to thousands of libraries, museums, and monasteries throughout the world. in hopes that it would keep memory of the capsule alive and prove to be a major map or key to its recovery. It was buried in Flushing Meadows, Queens, on the World's Fair site. Westinghouse dubbed it a time capsule. The one name they had for it was a time bomb. And it was lucky they didn't choose that, since the fair was bombed in 1940. The idea of a time capsule caught fire, particularly because of the incredible newsreel coverage of the whole project. People loved the idea of the technology. They loved the idea of miniaturization. They loved the idea of thinking about that far ahead. The theme of the World's Fair was the world of tomorrow, and this engaged everybody in this imaginative experience of thinking about what the future would be like. The time capsule became a household word, and time capsules from that point on kind of replaced ribbon cuttings as a way of celebrating civic events and historic occasions. New malls, the school year, every backyard and school practically ended up with time capsule of one kind or another, most of them homemade. In 1964, Westinghouse decided that one of the problems with time capsules is that they get out of date pretty quick. And by 1964, when there was another World's Fair in the same location, they decided to do a second time capsule to update the first one, and they buried it right next to it. This time, instead of a copper alloy, they used stainless steel. And they included information that could not have been in the first time capsule in 1939, which included World War II, atomic power, space flight, and the Beatles, among other things. The idea was that one of the problems with a time capsule is, do you really want the future to judge you by 1939 or 1964? Time capsules also had a habit of getting lost or stolen or even looted. A project here in Olympia is a good example of problems that can happen. Washington State did a time capsule for the Territorial Centennial in 1953. The main capsule contained information about Washington State, including predictions of the future. Its destination is the year 2053. The predictions, by the way, included the fact that American males would have too much leisure time on their hands, working only 20 hours a week, enough to make them pests to the average housewife. The main capsule, the one that was in the previous picture, the main capsule was buried in 1953 outside the Capitol building. But the legislature failed to appropriate the funds to mark the site. So its exact location has been unclear. It's buried somewhere between the Legislative Building and Temple of Justice. There was a second 1953 time capsule that also was prepared, and it was never buried. It wound up crated and in storage in the Capitol building. It was nearly thrown out during a cleanup project after the Nisqually earthquake. So it had been gathering dust there for 50 years. And in fact, a group that I was associated with called the International Time Capsule Society put that capsule on our list of 10 most wanted time capsules. These are time capsules that one how or another had gone astray. However, it was found in, I believe, 2002, and in 2005, it got the burial that it deserved.
Is that Sam Reed over there?
Yes, yeah, that's Sam. But it's interesting because you can see that some of the things that can happen are time capsules don't get buried. And in the case of the original 1953 capsule, there weren't the funds to actually mark the location so people could find it later. Next. Other capsules have been buried in places where they could not easily be recovered, such as under heavy equipment. MIT has one that was buried under a huge cyclotron, like an atom smasher that weighs, so many tons, no one will ever be able to get at it. Others are simply not marked. People have very short memories when they bury things. One of the major time capsules of the U.S. Bicentennial traveled across the country in this wagon train that went to Valley Forge, and it was stolen before they could bury it. And no one has ever found that time capsule. So the time capsules can be surprisingly hard to hang on to. Burying a time capsule is also a problem. The ground is a hostile environment for many things like metal, paper, and film, wood, cloth. In 1989, I remember First Lady Jean Gardner telling me about going to a time capsule opening in eastern Washington, and when the capsule was opened, nothing but green, waterlogged slime came out. It got on her, and she wasn't happy about it. Pictured here is a 1977 capsule, I think from Virginia. The capsule basically turned everything in it to a bucket of mush. Needless to say, people get really unhappy when this happens, but it's really very common. Next. In 1989, it was decided to come up with a time capsule project for the Washington State Centennial, and I was approached by Put Barber, head of the Centennial staff, and asked to come up with one. My idea was a capsule, or more accurately, a collection of capsules that address some of these issues and that would engage the public over time. We decided to create time capsules, 16 in all, with the idea that each one would be filled at 25-year intervals. The custom-made capsules were manufactured by the Westinghouse Hanford Company in Richland, Washington. They were stainless steel and fit into a massive data safe that was donated, that we painted and put on display. We believe that making the safe visible and initiating a multi-year updating process would help keep the time capsule from being lost, and it would create a unique record like the strata of an archaeological site of layering information and technology that would show how our thinking and history evolved over time. We picked 2389 as the date when all of the capsules would be open, and that's Washington State's 500th birthday. We then decided to put someone in charge of the updating process. So we recruited 300 school children, 10 years old, with birthdays on or near November 11th. And we invited them to the Capitol on 11/11/89 to be sworn in as keepers of the capsule. The event received international publicity. The 1989 capsule, we then created a nonprofit. This is, I think, a picture from People magazine. I'm sitting in the middle with all these kids around. We then created a nonprofit organization with Putnam Barber, myself, and then Secretary of State Ralph Monroe as officers to provide support to the keepers. The idea was the keepers would return to the Capitol in 2013 and begin the process of deciding what would go in the 2014 capsule, and to recruit a new generation, call it Gen 2.0, of keepers. Now, the 1989 capsule contains Microsoft software on big disks, a Nordstrom catalog, over 10,000 messages to the future from Washingtonians, and some of those messages are really fascinating. We put them in unedited, we microfilmed them and put them into the capsule, and we had messages from, one of my favorite ones was from a kid up in Bellingham who wrote, dear people of the future, my favorite band is Metallica, which you probably consider to be classical by now. But we also, we had a man who was one of the very first participants in an AIDS experiment talking about the uncertainty of his future. People really, it was amazing the stories that people told. We also included a flag, a state flag that was flown on the space shuttle by Bonnie Dunbar, who assisted us with that. On February 22nd, 1990, the capsule was put into place in the safe, and the capsule had been, the individual capsule had been filled with argon gas to protect the contents. The safe was shut for 25 years. Here we are closing the safe. This year we're getting ready for 11/11/14, State's 125th birthday celebration. Last fall we removed the 2014 capsule and put it on display. Go to the next slide. Yeah, put it on display in the Secretary of State's office. We're currently gathering ideas and objects and messages for the time capsule. We're recruiting a new generation of 10-year-old keepers. We'll be swearing them in Olympia on November 11th. And also in the safe, we left some gifts for the current generation of keepers. So there's a shelf in there that has stuff for the well, now 35-year-olds. Yeah, there's some gifts in there for them. And we did that for two reasons. One is we thought, well, if they're going to open the safe with all this kind of hoopla, they're going to want to find something. So we'll leave something in there. Each generation can leave something.
Who did that?
Who did what?
Who did the actual choose the gifts for the future?
It was our time capsule committee. It was Putt and me, and there were some other people advising us. And honestly, I can't remember what all we put in there, but I do know there's at least one good bottle of Washington wine that's been in there, getting ready for them.
Maybe cookies.
Yeah, yeah, and pardon me.
Are there gifts for the new keepers too?
No, but they will be receiving items as part of their initiation, and that proved to be a very important thing, which is one of the things that we've been kind of learning talking to these people that are now 35 who were 10 years old. It was like, well, what do you remember? What impressed you? Why did this seem important to you? Well, I'll get to that. But, well, I mean, one of the things they said was the ceremony meant a lot, the hoopla around it. They all remember they got these T-shirts with the Native American design on them, and one of the keepers, in fact, go to the next slide. Yeah, she can still fit into it. She's got her keeper T-shirt on. And they you know, some of them remember a lot of detail, and others have virtually no memory of it. But enough of them remembered to show up. So the first generation of keepers is doing its work. 1989, they were 10. They came back in their mid-30s. We're lucky they're a dedicated group. We lost track of many of them over time. The years between age 10 and 35 is full of change. Obviously, keepers grow up. They have families. They move, join the military. They pass away. And it was trickier keeping track of folks, especially also with technological changes. We had their parents' addresses, but you know, they went off, then they got on email and other things. And however, we were able to get good contact information for about 80 of the 300. The keepers hope that the organization that we set up for them, Keepers of the Capsule, Washington Keepers of the Capsule, will be able to be an ongoing group. They'd like to have it be, we created the group and then ignored it for 24 years and then had to kind of restart it from scratch. It's kind of like putting a Model T in your garage and then coming back years later and trying to start the motor. They'd like to kind of keep it up and running and provide more kind of ongoing mentoring and maybe programs to plug the kids into over time. Let's go to another. We're also discussing what to put into the 2014 capsule. It's up to the keepers to decide what they want to put in. We've been talking to them about what we put in previously. Our guidelines are that we hope to be able to include information about events between 1989 and 2014, that we hope to capture a picture of life in our times in 2014. We're soliciting messages to the future again. This time we can also do that by email. We've consulted experts in many fields. We're looking at objects that themselves may convey important stories, such as a Seahawks Super Bowl ring, or a Kindle loaded with ebooks by Washington authors. Will anyone be able to power up a Kindle in 2389? Maybe, maybe not. But we're getting assistance from the State Archives Office on how to give such things the best chance of survival. Time capsules never offer certainty, but they do give us a chance to craft messages that might prove to be valuable and certainly will be interesting in ways we cannot anticipate. And just to sum up, the capsule is in a secure, visible location, protected, and with the benefit of the institutional memory of the Capitol and its officers, custodians, and rules. The technique for updating via keepers ensures a dynamic process that promotes continuity and cultivates stewardship and appreciation of both history and thinking about the future among young people. It also gives us a chance to change course or correct along the way and learn how to do this better. It creates a layered understanding of time and progress. It shows ways in which our sense of what is possible, what is important, and what can be accomplished as it evolves over time. And it's really a challenging thought experiment to think about, well, 400 years from now, what might be meaningful to somebody? And the best comparison that we've come up with is to say, well, what if we found a time capsule that was put together by the Puritans, say the Pilgrims? That's roughly the time difference that we're talking about. I think we'd be really interested in what the average Pilgrim or Puritan had to say and what they thought was important and how they told the story of their lives, and that's often what gets missing in official history. Its experiment in the long-term multi-generational communication. Will the keepers become a secret society like the Masons and Rosicrucians? Will people get tired of updating the capsule? Will 25 years prove to be too long or too short an interval? Will it be tampered with? Over the next 50 years, we'll know a good deal more about how this experiment is going. This is just the first stage. You all can help too. We have an organization at capsulekeepers.org, ways you can participate, donate, and track what we're doing. We're on Facebook too, Washington Keepers of the Capsule. I'd just like to close by thanking you for the privilege of coming and speaking to you today and talking about this. It's obviously a project I'm passionate about, and I think it's very exciting for the future of heritage in Washington. Thank you.